Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we share those stories that keep you up at night, or make your bedtime just a little more unsettling. I'm glad you're here tonight because what I have for you is something truly chilling. A tale of fear, paranoia, and things far beyond explanation. So dim the lights, grab your headphones if you're alone, and settle in. Let's dive into it. It was the summer of 2004, and I was 22 years old, still fresh-faced, but already carrying the weight of adulthood on my shoulders. Life had been uneventful up until that point. A predictable rhythm of work, sleep, and fleeting moments of fun with friends. But everything changed one humid July evening, when I returned home from a weekend camping trip to find my mother sitting alone in the dimly lit living room, her face pale and drawn. The house felt unusually silent, like the kind of quiet that settles over a place after something terrible has happened. My first instinct was to call out for my dad, but no answer came. Instead, Mom simply looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. A mix of sadness, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite place. She motioned for me to sit down beside her, and as I did, she began to speak in a voice so soft it barely registered above a whisper. "Your father's gone," she said finally, her words slicing through the stillness like a knife. "He left 2 days ago." I froze, my mind struggling to process what she meant. Gone? Did she mean dead? Or had he just walked out without saying goodbye? I asked her, my voice trembling, but all she could do was shake her head. No note? No warning. He'd packed a bag, climbed into his truck, and driven off into the night, leaving behind nothing but questions. For hours, we sat there together, neither of us speaking much. Mom cried quietly, while I tried to make sense of it all, piecing together fragments of memories and wondering if there had been signs I'd missed. Had he been unhappy? Was this some sort of midlife crisis? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? Over the next few weeks, our family fell into an uneasy silence. Relatives called and visited, offering condolences and advice, but no one seemed willing to dig too deeply into why Dad had left. It was as though everyone feared, uncovering answers they weren't ready to face. And yet the more time passed, the more my curiosity grew. Something about the way Mom avoided talking about him made me suspect she knew more than she let on. By the end of August, I decided I needed to take matters into my own hands. I started by reaching out to Dad's closest friend, a man named Greg, who'd known him since high school. Greg sounded surprised to hear from me, almost as if he hadn't expected anyone to come looking for answers. He didn't know where Dad might have gone, but he mentioned a name that sent chills down my spine: Black Hollow. Greg explained that Black Hollow was a tiny, remote town, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place Dad used to talk about, visiting during his college years. According to Greg, Dad had always spoken fondly of its dense forests and eerie legends, describing it as a place untouched by time. Could he really have gone there? And if so, why now? Determined to find out, I mapped out a route to Black Hollow, knowing full well it would be a long and grueling journey. The town was practically off the grid, accessible only via winding mountain roads and narrow dirt trails. Winter travel was impossible due to heavy snowfall, and even in summer the terrain posed significant challenges. But none of that mattered to me. All I cared about was finding my dad and discovering the truth behind his sudden disappearance. As I packed my car and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something far bigger than myself. Whatever awaited me in Black Hollow, I knew it wouldn't be easy. But I also knew I couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when every fiber of my being told me that the answers were waiting somewhere out there in the wilderness. The drive to Black Hollow took 3 exhausting days, each mile stretching longer than the last. By the time I arrived, late on the afternoon of my 3rd day, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, thick with the promise of rain, as I pulled into the town's single gas station, the only sign of civilization for miles. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of awe and unease. Black Hollow was smaller than I'd imagined, little more than a cluster of weathered buildings, surrounded by towering trees. There was the gas station, a general store, a post office, and what appeared to be a makeshift diner tucked into the corner of a creaky wooden building. Beyond that, the forest loomed like a wall, swallowing everything in its path. The population sign near the entrance read 57, though I doubted anyone had bothered updating it in decades. The gas station attendant, a wiry man in his late 50s named Earl, greeted me with a curious look. Outsiders rarely ventured this far into the mountains, and my arrival clearly piqued his interest. After filling up my tank, I seized the opportunity to ask about my father, showing Earl a photo I'd brought along. To my disappointment, he didn't recognize him, but then, almost hesitantly, he mentioned hearing stories about a stranger matching Dad's description passing through town a few months earlier. Earl pointed me toward the local sheriff's office, which doubled as the town hall, suggesting I speak with Sheriff Hargrove. He knows everyone who comes and goes around here, Earl said cryptically, his tone hinting at secrets buried beneath the surface. Sheriff Hargrove turned out to be a gruff but kind-hearted man in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. His office was cluttered but welcoming, filled with maps, old photographs, and stacks of paperwork. When I explained my situation, he listened intently, nodding occasionally but not interrupting. Then after a long pause, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "There's something you should know," he began slowly. "A few years back, your dad was involved in, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. He came here looking for someone, a woman named Clara Bennett. She disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and your dad was one of the last people to see her alive." My heart sank. This wasn't what I'd expected to hear. Clara Bennett? Who was she? And why had Dad been searching for her? The sheriff went on to explain that Clara had vanished without a trace during a hiking trip in the nearby woods. Her campsite was found abandoned, her belongings scattered as if she'd fled in a hurry. Though no evidence directly implicated Dad, his connection to her disappearance had cast suspicion over him, leading to strained relationships with locals and a cloud of doubt that lingered long after he left town. Hargrove handed me a folder containing old case files, including photos of Clara and transcripts of interviews conducted at the time. One particular image caught my eye, a grainy black and white photograph of Clara standing near a massive tree stump, its gnarled roots twisted into shapes that resembled claw marks. Behind her loomed the shadowy outline of a figure, my dad. "I don't know why he came back," the sheriff admitted, "but if he's out there, he'll likely be heading toward the woods. That's where most folks go when they're chasing ghosts." With renewed determination, I set out to retrace Dad's steps. The forest surrounding Black Hollow was vast and unforgiving. A labyrinth of jagged cliffs, rushing streams, and ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone brave enough to listen. Armed with a map, a flashlight, and the contents of the sheriff's folder, I ventured into the wilderness, determined to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might be. The forest swallowed me whole. Within minutes of stepping off the main road, the world narrowed to a tunnel of towering pines and tangled underbrush. The air grew cooler, damp with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally loud, as though the woods themselves were listening. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, but revealed little more than gnarled roots, shadowy shapes, and the occasional glint of something metallic half buried in the dirt. A rusted tin can, a shard of broken glass, remnants of those who had come before me. I followed the map Sheriff Hargrove had given me, tracing the path Clara Bennett was last known to have taken. According to the case files, she'd been an amateur photographer documenting the region's natural beauty when she vanished. Her photos offered glimpses into her final days, serene shots of sun-dappled streams, close-ups of wildflowers, and that haunting image near the tree stump where Dad stood in the background. What had drawn him here? Was it guilt, curiosity, or something darker? As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and the forest transformed. The silence became oppressive, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl, or the distant howl of what I hoped was just a wolf. I set up camp beneath the shelter of a massive oak tree, its branches twisting skyward like skeletal fingers. As I ate a cold meal from my pack, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves made me glance over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. It wasn't long before sleep eluded me entirely. Instead, I found myself poring over the contents of the folder again, searching for clues I might have missed. One detail stood out this time. A handwritten note tucked inside the file, barely legible. It read, "Look for the hollow oak." Below it was a crude drawing of a tree, with a hollow trunk shaped like a crescent moon. There was no explanation, no context, just those 4 words scrawled hastily on yellowed paper. At first light, I packed up my gear and continued deeper into the woods. The terrain grew rougher, the trail harder to follow. Hours passed, and just when I began to doubt whether I'd find anything at all, I stumbled upon it. A colossal oak tree whose base had split open centuries ago, forming a cavernous hollow. Its shape matched the drawing perfectly inside the hollow. I discovered a small wooden box partially buried in the soil. My hands trembled as I pulled it free and opened it. Inside was a collection of items. A tarnished silver locket engraved with the initials CB, a roll of undeveloped film, and a folded letter addressed to my father. The letter was brief, written in shaky handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I'm already gone. Please forgive me for not telling you sooner. I should have trusted you, but fear clouded my judgment. If anyone asks, tell them the truth. The forest isn't what it seems. It takes things, people, memories, lives, and it doesn't give them back. I've seen too much. Stay away from the clearing beyond the ridge. Don't let it take you too." The note ended abruptly, leaving me with more questions than answers. Who had written it, and why had they left it here for Dad to find? Or perhaps for someone else? Before I could process what I'd uncovered, a sound behind me froze me in place. A low growl, guttural and unnatural, reverberated through the trees. Slowly I turned, my flashlight trembling in my grip. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, or at least something that resembled one. Its silhouette shifted unnaturally, limbs elongating and contorting as if defying the laws of physics. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it melted back into the shadows. Heart pounding, I grabbed my belongings and fled, retracing my steps toward the safety of town. But even as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd encountered in the forest wasn't done with me yet. Back in Black Hollow, I sought refuge in the diner, hoping familiarity would ground me after the terror of the previous night. The warmth of the room and the comforting aroma of coffee provided some solace. But my mind kept replaying the events in the forest. The growling, the shifting figure, the cryptic note. Something about the phrase, "The forest isn't what it seems," lingered heavily in my thoughts. Earl, the gas station attendant, happened to be sitting at the counter nursing a cup of coffee. When I approached him, he greeted me with a knowing look, as if he'd been expecting me. Without prompting, he launched into a story about the history of Black Hollow, his voice low and conspiratorial. "This land has always been cursed," he said, leaning closer. Long before settlers arrived, the indigenous tribes avoided these woods. They called it Manitou, the Spirit Mountain. They believed it was a gateway, a place where the veil between worlds is thinnest. Some say the spirits here are restless, trapped between life and death. Others claim there's something older, something ancient, lurking beneath the surface. Earl paused, glancing around the nearly empty diner, as though ensuring no one else was listening. Years ago, people used to disappear all the time. Locals blamed it on bears or accidents, but everyone knew the truth. The forest, it calls to certain people. It lures them in and swallows them whole. His words sent a chill down my spine, especially considering Clara Bennett's disappearance. Could her fate, and possibly my father's, be tied to these legends? Desperate for more information, I visited the town's tiny library, housed in a converted cabin at the edge of the main street. The librarian, a frail, elderly woman named Mrs. Whitaker, greeted me warmly but seemed uneasy when I asked about local folklore. She hesitated before pulling out a dusty book titled Legends of the Appalachians. Flipping to a marked page, she pointed to an illustration of a monstrous creature described as the Manitou, a shape-shifting entity said to guard the boundary between realms. "They say it feeds on fear," Mrs. Whitaker whispered, her voice barely audible, "and it punishes those who trespass too deeply into its domain." Armed with new insights, I returned to Sheriff Hargrove's office. He listened patiently as I recounted my findings, nodding grimly as I mentioned the Manitou legend. "It's funny," he mused. "Your dad never mentioned any of that stuff when he was here. He just kept asking about Clara. But now that you bring it up," he trailed off, rifling through his desk until he produced another faded photograph. This one showed a group of hikers gathered around a stone altar deep in the woods. At the center of the group stood Clara, and beside her, unmistakably, was my father. Their expressions were tense, almost fearful, as though they'd interrupted something they weren't meant to see. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to the altar. Hargrove frowned. "That's Devil's Ridge. It's a sacred site, or so the locals believe. Some say it's where the Manitou resides. Your dad was obsessed with finding it during his last visit. Said it held answers." With renewed urgency, I resolved to return to the forest. But this time, I wouldn't go alone. For my second journey into the wilderness, I enlisted Earl's help. Though reluctant at first, he agreed to accompany me part way, citing his familiarity with the trails. We set out early, armed with supplies and a healthy dose of trepidation. Earl shared stories of other hikers who had ventured too far into the mountains and never returned, their fates reduced to whispers and warnings told around campfires. Our destination was Devil's Ridge, the mysterious location depicted in the photograph. The hike was grueling, the path steep and treacherous. As we climbed higher, the forest grew quieter, the usual sounds of bird song and rustling leaves replaced by an eerie stillness. By mid-afternoon, we reached the ridge, where the trees gave way to a rocky plateau, dominated by the stone altar from the photo. The air felt heavier here, charged with an energy that prickled against my skin. Etched into the altar were symbols unlike anything I'd ever seen. Twisting patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from different angles. In the center of the altar lay a shallow depression filled with ash, as though fires had burned there recently. Earl refused to stay longer than necessary, muttering prayers under his breath as he hurried back down the trail. Left alone, he examined the altar more closely, snapping photos and sketching the symbols in my notebook. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed a faint glow emanating from beneath the stones. Digging carefully, I unearthed a small leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth. Flipping through its pages, I realized it belonged to Clara Bennett. Her entries detailed her growing unease as she explored the forest, describing strange visions and encounters with shadowy figures. The final entry chilled me to the bone. Tonight I saw it, the Manitou. It spoke without words, showing me things I cannot unsee. It wants something from me, something buried deep within the earth. I don't know how much longer I can resist its pull. If anyone finds this, please tell my family I'm sorry, and warn them, do not follow me. Suddenly the wind picked up, carrying with it a low, mournful wail. Panicked, I stuffed the journal into my pack and scrambled down the ridge, pursued by the same guttural growl I'd heard before. The descent from Devil's Ridge was a blur of panic and adrenaline. The growling echoed behind me, louder now, accompanied by the sound of snapping branches as whatever pursued me moved with unnatural speed. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of twisted shapes in the darkness. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it might burst through my chest. When I finally reached the relative safety of the trailhead, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. Whatever, or whoever, had been chasing me had vanished into the shadows, but the oppressive weight of its presence lingered. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, even as I drove back to Black Hollow under the cover of night. Back at the motel, a rickety building with peeling paint and creaky floors, I locked myself in my room and pored over Clara's journal. Each entry revealed more about her descent into paranoia and fear. She described recurring dreams of standing before the altar, surrounded by swirling mists and voices whispering in languages she didn't understand. In one particularly chilling passage, she wrote, "It knows my name. It calls to me at night, promising answers if I bring it what it seeks. But I don't know what it wants. Sometimes I think it's buried inside me, clawing its way out." Her words sent shivers down my spine. What could the Manitou possibly want? And why did it seem so fixated on her, and perhaps my father too? As dawn broke, Exhaustion pulled me into a fitful sleep, but my rest was anything but peaceful. I dreamt of the forest, vast and endless, stretching far beyond the horizon. At its center stood the stone altar, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Figures emerged from the trees, their forms indistinct, yet unmistakably human. They circled the altar, chanting in unison, their voices rising to an ear-splitting crescendo. Then suddenly, they turned to face me, their faces blank voids save for hollow eyes that burned with cold blue fire. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat and trembling. Outside, the sky was still dark, but something felt wrong. The air was unnaturally still, and the usual sounds of crickets and distant traffic were absent. Grabbing the journal and my flashlight, I ventured outside, drawn inexplicably toward the woods, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away. At the edge of the forest, I found Earl waiting for me. His expression was grim, his hands shaking as he clutched a rifle. "You shouldn't be here," he said hoarsely. "Not tonight." "Why not?" I demanded, though part of me already knew the answer. "It's the blood moon," he replied, nodding toward the sky. Sure enough, a deep red glow illuminated the horizon, casting an eerie light over the landscape. On nights like this, the veil thins. The Manitou walks freely. Before I could respond, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence, echoing from somewhere deep within the woods. Earl grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the motel. "We need to get inside, now." But I couldn't move. Something compelled me to follow the sound, to step deeper into the forest. As I hesitated, a figure emerged from the shadows, the same shifting silhouette I'd seen near the hollow oak. This time, however, it didn't retreat. Instead, it stepped closer, resolving into a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and tendrils, its form constantly writhing and reshaping itself. Its eyes glowed with the same blue fire I'd seen in my dream. And then it spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. Its voice was a cacophony of whispers, overlapping and discordant, each syllable heavy with malice. "You seek the truth," it said, "but are you prepared to pay the price?" The Manitou's question reverberated in my mind long after its form dissolved into the mist. Pay the price? What did it mean? And what price could possibly be worth uncovering the truth about my father and Clara Bennett? Earl dragged me back to the motel, insisting we barricade ourselves inside until sunrise. He refused to speak further about the creature, muttering prayers and clutching his rifle like a lifeline. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about the journal and the clues hidden within its pages. If I wanted answers, I needed to go deeper, not just into the forest, but into the history of Black Hollow itself. The next morning, I returned to Mrs. Whitaker at the library. Her reaction to my questions was immediate and visceral. She recoiled as though I'd struck her, her frail frame trembling. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Manitou doesn't show itself unless it has chosen someone." "I need to know more," I pressed. "What does it want? Why is it tied to Devil's Ridge?" She hesitated, then gestured for me to follow her to a locked cabinet at the back of the room. Unlocking it with a key hung around her neck, she retrieved an ancient leather-bound tome. The cover bore no title, or only a crude etching of the same symbols carved into the stone altar. "This book contains stories passed down through generations," she explained. "They say the Manitou was once a guardian, protecting the boundary between worlds. But when settlers arrived, they disturbed the balance, angering the spirit. It began taking sacrifices, people who strayed too close to Devil's Ridge. According to the text, the Manitou demanded offerings to maintain the barrier separating the living from the dead. Over time, locals performed rituals to appease it, leaving tokens and tributes at the altar. But as belief in the old ways faded, so did the Manitou's patience. It grew restless, luring victims into the forest to claim them as its own. One passage caught my attention. Only those marked by the Manitou may cross the threshold. To do so willingly is to invite madness or death. Yet some believe the Manitou grants visions of truths unseen, revealing secrets buried in the earth and soul alike. Could this explain why Dad had returned to Black Hollow? Had he been seeking answers about Clara? Or had he been searching for something else entirely? Determined to find out, I decided to return to Devil's Ridge during daylight, hoping the Manitou's influence would be weaker. Armed with the journal, the ancient tome, and a growing sense of dread, I set out once again, determined to confront the entity head-on. Standing before the stone altar on Devil's Ridge, I felt the weight of countless eyes upon me. Though the sun blazed overhead, the air remained frigid, carrying the faint scent of sulfur. I placed the journal and the tome side by side on the altar, flipping through their pages in search of guidance. As I read aloud from the ancient text, reciting incantations meant to summon, or perhaps banish, the Manitou, the ground beneath me trembled. A low rumble shook the ridge, sending loose stones tumbling down the slope. Shadows coalesced around the altar, forming the familiar writhing mass of limbs and tendrils. The Manitou loomed above me, its form shifting endlessly. Its voice invaded my thoughts once more, louder and more insistent than before. "You dare disturb my slumber," it hissed. "Speak your purpose, mortal, or perish where you stand." Summoning every ounce of courage, I held up Clara's journal. "I'm looking for answers. My father came here searching for someone named Clara Bennett. She disappeared years ago. Do you know what happened to her?" The Manitou paused, its movements slowing as though considering my request. Then, without warning, images flooded my mind. Clara stumbling through the forest, clutching the silver locket. My father kneeling beside the hollow oak, tears streaming down his face. Both of them standing before the altar, surrounded by shadowy figures. And then, clarity struck. Clara hadn't run away or been taken by the Manitou. She had willingly crossed the threshold, sacrificing herself to protect something or someone. When the visions subsided, I found myself sprawled on the ground, the journal clutched tightly in my hand. The Manitou was gone, leaving behind only silence and the faint scent of charred wood. The visions left me disoriented, my mind struggling to reconcile what I'd seen with the fragments of truth I'd pieced together so far. Clara hadn't simply vanished. She had chosen her fate, stepping willingly into whatever lay beyond the threshold. But why? What could possibly compel someone to make such a sacrifice? And how was my father connected to it all? As I sat on the rocky plateau of Devil's Ridge, trying to steady my breathing, I noticed something etched into the underside of the altar. Series of symbols that matched those in the ancient tome, but arranged in a pattern I hadn't seen before. They seemed to form a map, pointing toward a specific location deep within the forest. My fingers traced the markings, and as they did, the ground beneath me shifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small clay jar sealed with wax. Breaking the seal, I found a bundle of brittle parchment scrolls tied with twine. Unrolling them carefully, I discovered sketches of an underground cavern system, along with notes written in a language I didn't recognize at first glance. But then, flipping through the ancient tome again, I realized the script was identical to parts of the text Mrs. Whitaker had shown me. These weren't just maps. They were instructions for navigating the labyrinth below Therage. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what this meant. Clara hadn't only crossed the threshold, she had descended into the earth itself. Whatever the Manitou guarded or demanded, it was buried far beneath the surface. And if he wanted answers about her disappearance and my father's connection, I would have to follow her path, armed with the scrolls, the journal, and a growing sense of dread. I returned to Black Hollow under the cover of night. Earl refused to accompany me any further, his earlier warnings now bordering on hysteria. "You're playing with forces you don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "Whatever you think you'll find down there, it's not worth your soul." Ignoring his pleas, I set out alone, guided by the crude map Clara had left behind. The entrance to the caverns was marked by a jagged fissure in the earth near the base of Devil's Ridge, partially obscured by fallen logs and overgrown vegetation. As I squeezed through the narrow opening, the air grew colder, carrying with it the faint smell of damp stone and decay. Inside, the walls glistened with moisture, reflecting the beam of my flashlight in eerie patterns. The tunnels twisted and turned unpredictably, following the contours of the natural rock formations. Every step echoed unnaturally loud, as though the mountain itself were alive and listening. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Faint whispers began to drift through the darkness. Their source, impossible to pinpoint. At times they sounded like voices calling my name. Other times, they dissolved into guttural growls or mournful wails. It took every ounce of willpower to keep moving forward. After what felt like hours, I reached a chamber unlike anything I'd encountered so far. The ceiling soared high above, disappearing into shadow, while the floor sloped downward toward a pool of black water. In the center of the room stood another altar, smaller than the one on Devil's Ridge, but equally ominous. Etched into its surface were the same symbols I'd seen before, but here they glowed faintly with an unnatural light. Scattered around the chamber were remnants of past visitors, rusted tools, tattered clothing, and bones bleached white by time. Among them, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A silver locket engraved with the initials CB. Clara had been here. Picking up the locket, I opened it to reveal a faded photograph inside. To my shock, it wasn't Clara staring back at me. It was my father, young and smiling, standing beside her. They looked happy, carefree, as though no darkness existed between them. On the back of the photo, someone had scrawled a single word: forgive. My hands trembled as I stared at the image, memories flooding back. Dad had always been distant, preoccupied, but I'd never questioned why. Had he loved Clara once? Was that why he'd come to Black Hollow? To confront the guilt of losing her? Or was there something darker? Something he hadn't dared tell anyone? Before I could dwell on it further, the whispers intensified, coalescing into a single voice that echoed through the chamber. "You've found her," it said, soft yet commanding. "But are you prepared to face what she gave everything to protect?" From the shadows emerged the Manitou, its form shifting and writhing as it approached. Unlike before, it seemed less menacing, almost sorrowful. Its glowing eyes fixed on me, and I felt a wave of emotions crash over me. Not my own, but someone else's. Grief, regret, love, and then clarity struck. Clara hadn't sacrificed herself to save herself. She'd done it to protect my father. The cavern shook violently as the artifact shattered, releasing a torrent of energy that rippled through the chamber like an earthquake. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, forcing me to shield my face with my arms. For a moment, I thought the entire mountain might collapse around me, burying me alongside Clara's memory. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the tremors ceased, leaving behind an eerie stillness. I stood there, panting, my body trembling not just from exhaustion, but from the sheer weight of what I'd done. Destroying the artifact felt both liberating and devastating, like tearing apart a cursed relic, while simultaneously severing a lifeline to something sacred. My father had come here, seeking redemption, but now, standing in this desolate underground tomb, I couldn't help but wonder if his actions were noble or selfish. Had he been trying to undo Clara's sacrifice, or had he simply sought closure for himself? As I turned to leave, I noticed something glinting faintly in the rubble where the artifact had been. Kneeling down, I brushed away the dust to reveal a small, intricately carved key made of polished obsidian. It was warm to the touch, almost as though it held residual energy from the artifact. Instinctively, I slipped it into my pocket, unsure of its purpose but certain it wasn't meant to be left behind. Climbing back out of the caverns was harder than descending into them. Every step felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted my departure. The whispers that had accompanied me earlier were gone now, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. By the time I reached the surface, dawn was breaking over Devil's Ridge, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Yet even the beauty of sunrise couldn't dispel the unease lingering in my chest. Black Hollow loomed ahead, its weathered buildings casting long shadows across the empty streets. As I approached the sheriff's office, I spotted Hargrove waiting outside, his expression grim. He didn't say anything at first, merely studying me with eyes that seemed to weigh every ounce of guilt and grief radiating off me. "It's done," I said, finally, my voice hoarse from disuse. Hargrove nodded slowly, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. "Good," he replied, though there was no triumph in his tone, only resignation. "Your dad, he came here looking for answers. Maybe found some before he left. Or maybe he ran from them," I muttered under my breath, thinking of the countless nights Dad must have spent wrestling with his own demons. Hargrove didn't respond immediately. Instead, he led my inside, offering me a seat at his cluttered desk. On the wall behind him hung a faded map of the region, dotted with markers indicating areas of interest, including Devil's Ridge. Beneath the map was a corkboard, covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes detailing decades of disappearances linked to the forest. At the center of it all was a grainy black and white photo of Clara Bennett, her smile frozen in time. "She wasn't the first," Hargrove admitted, following my gaze, "and she won't be the last. People are drawn to these woods for reasons they don't always understand. Some call it fate, others call it madness. Either way, the Manitou has a way of finding those who trespass too far." "But why?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "Why does it need sacrifices? Why can't it just let people go?" Hargrove leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as though searching for the right words. "It's not about punishment, or at least not entirely. The Manitou is a guardian, but it's also a prisoner. bound to this land since time immemorial. It feeds on fear and despair because that's all it knows. When someone crosses the threshold willingly, they're giving themselves to it. Not just their lives, but their pain, their regrets, their secrets. That's how it survives. His explanation sent a shiver down my spine. Clara hadn't just sacrificed herself to protect my father. She'd offered up her soul to contain something ancient and unknowable. And yet, despite the gravity of her choice, part of me resented her for leaving him and me behind. Weeks passed after my return from Black Hollow. Life resumed its usual rhythm, though nothing felt quite the same anymore. Sleep eluded me most, nights plagued by dreams of shadowy figures and glowing blue eyes. During the day, I avoided mirrors, afraid of seeing the haunted reflection staring back at me. Then one morning, a letter arrived in the mail. There was a no-return address, only a single stamp bearing the image of a mountain peak I didn't recognize. Opening it cautiously, I unfolded a single sheet of paper, covered in handwriting I'd know anywhere. My father's. The message was brief, almost cryptic. Thank you for finishing what I started. No explanation, no apology. Just those 8 simple words scrawled in ink that smudged slightly as I traced them with my fingers. For hours, I sat staring at the note, replaying it over and again in my mind. Was this his way of saying goodbye? Or was it a confession, a tacit admission that he'd failed where I succeeded? Part of me wanted to track him down, to demand answers and confront him about the choice she'd made. But another quieter part understood that some questions could never truly be answered. Instead, I tucked the letter into a drawer alongside the silver locket and obsidian key, symbols of a past I couldn't change, but refused to forget. In the weeks following my encounter with the Manitou, I became increasingly obsessed with uncovering more about its origins. The ancient tome Mrs. Whitaker had shown me hinted at rituals performed by indigenous tribes long before settlers arrived in Black Hollow. According to the text, the Manitou wasn't originally malevolent. It had been a protector, tasked with maintaining the balance between worlds. But as colonization spread, the delicate equilibrium was disrupted, turning the spirit into a vengeful entity. Determined to learn more, I returned to the library, hoping Mrs. Whitaker might provide additional insight. She greeted me warily, her frail frame leaning heavily on a cane. "You shouldn't keep digging," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some truths are better left buried." "I need to understand," I insisted. "If the Manitou was once a guardian, why did it turn against us? What changed?" Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, then motioned for me to follow her to the locked cabinet where she kept forbidden texts. Unlocking it with trembling hands, she retrieved another leather-bound volume, this one smaller and more fragile than the first. Its pages were brittle, some crumbling at the edges, and written in a language I didn't recognize. "This belonged to my grandmother," she explained. "She was one of the last elders to practice the old ways. She believed the Manitou's corruption began when outsiders disturbed the sacred sites, when greed and arrogance replaced respect and reverence." Flipping through the book, I discovered illustrations depicting ceremonies conducted beneath the full moon. Participants wore masks carved from bone and carried torches lit with fire stolen from the stars. At the center of each ritual stood the stone altar, surrounded by offerings of food, herbs, and precious stones. "What happened to the ceremonies?" I asked. "They stopped," Mrs. Whitaker replied sadly. "When their settlers came, They outlawed our traditions, branding them pagan and barbaric. Without the rituals to appease the Manitou, it grew restless and hungry. Her words resonated deeply, shedding light on the cycle of suffering perpetuated by ignorance and fear. Yet they also raised new questions. Could the Manitou ever be restored to its original purpose, or was it doomed to remain a harbinger of doom? Driven by a mix of curiosity and guilt, I decided to venture back into the forest one final time, not to confront the Manitou, but to pay tribute to those who had sacrificed everything to contain it. Armed with candles, incense, and a bundle of wildflowers gathered near the edge of town, I made my way to Devil's Ridge under the cover of night. The air was thick with anticipation as I approached the altar, its surface cold and unyielding beneath my fingertips. Placing the offerings carefully, I lit the candles and recited fragments of prayers I'd memorized from the ancient texts. Though I didn't fully understand the words, their cadence felt familiar, as though they echoed across centuries. All forgotten rituals, as the flames flickered in the wind, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel, to mourn not just Clara and my father, but everyone who'd been lost to the forest's insatiable hunger. Tears streamed down my face, unchecked, mingling with the scent of burning herbs and damp earth. And then, just as I prepared to leave, a low hum filled the air, resonating deep within my bones. Opening my eyes, I saw faint blue lights dancing among the trees, illuminating paths invisible to mortal eyes. Whether it was the Manitou acknowledging my gesture or simply the forest reclaiming its own, I couldn't say. But as I walked away, I felt lighter, as though a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. The forest had always been a place of contradictions, beautiful yet terrifying, alive yet suffocating. As I drove away from Black Hollow for what I hoped would be the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with me. The Manitou may have retreated into silence after my offering at Devil's Ridge, but its presence lingered like an echo in my mind. It wasn't just guilt or fear. It was something deeper, almost primal, as if the land itself remembered me and wouldn't let me go so easily. Back home, life resumed its predictable rhythm, but even routine tasks felt hollow. Laundry piled up unattended, meals went uneaten, and phone calls from friends were ignored. My apartment became a sanctuary of sorts, though not in the comforting way one might expect. Instead, it felt like a cocoon, a fragile barrier between me and the outside world. I spent hours poring over the artifacts I'd brought back from Black Hollow. Clara's journal, the obsidian key, and the ancient tome. Each object seemed to pulse with latent energy, whispering secrets I couldn't fully decipher. But it was the obsidian key that consumed most of my attention. Unlike the other items, it didn't belong to anyone else. It had been entrusted to me, whether by chance or design. Its polished surface reflected light in strange ways, casting distorted shadows on the walls no matter where I placed it. At night, when insomnia gripped me, I'd hold it in my palm, tracing its intricate carvings with my fingertips. There was something hypnotic about it, almost soothing. Yet every time I touched it, I felt a faint vibration beneath my skin, as though it was trying to communicate. One evening, as rain lashed against my windows and thunder rolled in the distance, I decided to take a closer look at the key. Setting aside Clara's journal and the ancient tome, I placed the key under a desk lamp, examining it more closely than ever before. The carvings weren't random. They formed patterns that resembled constellations, their lines connecting points of light etched into the obsidian. As I stared at the markings, a memory surfaced unbidden. A dream I'd had shortly after destroying the artifact. In it, I stood in a cavern far larger than any I'd seen, its ceiling studded with glowing crystals that mimicked the night sky. At the center of the cavern was a massive door made of stone, its surface engraved with symbols identical to those on the key. Before I could approach it, the Manitou appeared, its form shifting endlessly as it blocked my path. "You are not ready," it had whispered, or rather, thought, directly into my mind. The memory jolted me awake, heart pounding, sweat soaking through my sheets. But now, staring at the key, I realized the dream hadn't been random. It was a clue, or perhaps a warning. Driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, I began researching geological formations in the Appalachian region, focusing on areas known for underground caves and caverns. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Deep within the mountains lay a network of limestone caves collectively referred to as the Veil. Local legends described them as portals to another realm, places where time flowed differently and reality bent to accommodate impossible truths. Few who ventured inside returned, and those who did spoke of visions and encounters they couldn't explain. It didn't take long to connect the dots. The door in my dream, the one guarded by the Manitou, was real, and the obsidian key was meant to unlock it. Preparing for another journey into the unknown wasn't easy, especially after everything I'd endured in Black Hollow. Part of me wanted to leave the past buried, to move on and pretend none of it had happened. But the pull of the key was irresistible, tugging at me like an invisible thread tied to my soul. I packed lightly this time, knowing that whatever awaited me beyond the door wouldn't care about survival gear or supplies. All I took was a flashlight, a notebook, and the obsidian key wrapped carefully in a cloth pouch. As I drove toward the coordinates marking the entrance to the Veil, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. Trees twisted skyward like skeletal hands, their branches bare despite the late summer season. Mist clung to the ground, swirling around my tires as though reluctant to part. When I finally arrived, the entrance to the cave system was marked by a jagged fissure in the earth, partially obscured by fallen rocks and tangled roots. A weathered sign warned trespassers to stay away, citing unstable terrain and toxic gases. Ignoring it, I squeezed through the narrow opening, descending into darkness. The air grew colder with each step, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic and sharp, like blood. My flashlight beam revealed walls glistening with moisture, reflecting eerie patterns that seemed to shift when I looked away. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, until breathing felt like dragging air through water. After what felt like hours, I reached a vast chamber illuminated by faint blue light, emanating from crystalline formations embedded in the ceiling. At the center of the room stood the door from my dream, its surface rough-hewn and ancient, covered in carvings that matched the ones on the key. Approaching it cautiously, I pulled the obsidian key from its pouch and examined it one final time. Its weight felt heavier now, as though it bore the burden of countless generations. Placing it against the door, I turned it slowly, feeling resistance. At first, then a soft click as the mechanism gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a void darker than anything I'd ever encountered. Stepping through, I braced myself for whatever lay ahead. On the other side of the door was nothing, or rather, everything. Time and space dissolved into a kaleidoscope of images and sensations, each fragment representing a moment in history. I saw civilizations rise and fall, wars waged and lost, love blooming and fading. Among them were glimpses of Clara and my father, not as they were, but as they could have been. In one vision, they grew old together, their lives filled with joy and laughter. In another, they parted ways bitterly, haunted by choices they couldn't undo. But the most vivid image was of myself, or rather, a version of me untouched by the events of the past few months. This alternates have lived a quiet, ordinary life, free from the weight of responsibility and regret. For a fleeting moment, I considered staying there, allowing the illusion to consume me. Then the voice of the Manitou broke through the visions, grounding me in reality. "You cannot rewrite the past," it intoned. "Only honor it." With those words, the visions faded, leaving me standing in an empty expanse bathed in golden light. The Manitou materialized before me, its form solid and unwavering for the first time. "You have faced your fears," it said, its voice resonating like a chorus. "Now choose wisely. Will you carry the burden of knowledge, or will you relinquish it?" Holding the obsidian key tightly, I made my decision. The golden light surrounding me dimmed, replaced by an oppressive darkness that pressed against my skin like a second layer. The Manitou loomed before me, its form now more defined than ever, solid yet fluid, as though it existed in multiple states simultaneously. Its glowing blue eyes pierced through the gloom, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "You have faced your fears," it repeated, its voice resonant and layered, as if spoken by 1,000 voices at once. "But facing fear is only the beginning. To carry knowledge is to carry weight, a burden heavier than stone, sharper than steel." I tightened my grip on the obsidian key, its cool surface grounding me amidst the swirling chaos. My mind raced, trying to process what the Manitou was asking of me. Was this some kind of test? A final hurdle before I could walk away unscathed? Or was it offering me a choice? One that would define not just my future, but perhaps the fate of others as well. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling, despite my best efforts to sound steady. "What knowledge are you talking about?" The Manitou didn't answer immediately. Instead, I'd extended one of its writhing appendages toward me, brushing against my forehead lightly. The touch sent a jolt through my body, flooding my senses with images, sounds, and emotions so vivid they felt real. In an instant, I was no longer standing in the void. I found myself transported to a time long before settlers arrived in Black Hollow, to an era when the land thrived under the care of indigenous tribes who revered it as sacred. I watched as elders performed rituals beneath the full moon, their chants harmonizing with the rustling leaves and rushing streams. Fire danced atop stone altars, illuminating faces painted with symbols of protection and gratitude. At the heart of these ceremonies stood the Manitou, not as a malevolent force, but as a guardian spirit tasked with maintaining balance between worlds. It appeared then as a towering figure cloaked in mist, its presence commanding respect rather than fear. People approached it willingly, offering gifts of food, herbs, and handmade trinkets. In return, the Manitou bestowed blessings upon the land, ensuring bountiful harvests and safe passage for hunters. But as centuries passed, the harmony began to fracture. Settlers arrived, driven by greed and ambition. They saw the forest not as a living entity, but as a resource to be exploited. Sacred sites were desecrated, rituals outlawed, and traditions erased. The Manitou, once revered, became feared. A misunderstood relic of a forgotten past. Then came the artifact, buried deep within the caverns. It wasn't created by human hands. It predated humanity itself, existing as a fragment of something far older and more powerful. When Clara unearthed it, she unknowingly awakened forces beyond comprehension. Her sacrifice had contained the artifact's influence temporarily, but the damage had already been done. The Manitou, bound to the land, absorbed the corruption seeping from the artifact, transforming into the vengeful entity I'd encountered in the forest. As the visions unfolded, I realized the true nature of the cycle. Every act of destruction, every betrayal of trust, added layers of suffering to the Manitou's essence. It wasn't inherently evil. It was a reflection of humanity's failures, a mirror held up to show us our darkest impulses. When the visions subsided, I found myself back in the void, the Manitou watching me intently. My knees buckled under the weight of what I'd witnessed, tears streaming down my face unchecked. "So now you see," the Manitou said, its tone softer but no less grave. "To carry this knowledge is to understand the cost of hubris, the price of ignorance. Will you shoulder the burden, or will you abandon it to those who come after you?" Its words struck a chord deep within me. This wasn't just about me or my father, or even Clara. It was about everyone who had ever set foot in Black Hollow, knowingly or otherwise. Each person played a role in perpetuating the cycle, whether through action or inaction. By choosing to destroy the artifact, I had disrupted the status quo, but the scars remained, and now I had to decide how to move forward. Part of me wanted to reject the responsibility entirely, to leave the truth buried and hope someone else would step up when the time came. But another part understood that running wouldn't solve anything. If I walked away now, I'd be no better than the settlers who ignored the warnings of the tribes, no better than my father who fled rather than confront his guilt. Taking a deep breath, I straightened my posture and met the Manitou's gaze head on. "I'll carry the burden," I said firmly, though my voice wavered slightly. Not because I want to, but because someone has to. For a moment, there was silence. Then the Manitou nodded, slowly, its form shimmering as though satisfied. "Very well," it intoned. "But know this, knowledge alone is not enough. You must also act. The choices you make will ripple outward, shaping the lives of countless others. Choose wisely." With that, the void dissolved around me, leaving me standing once again in the cavern behind the door. The obsidian key glowed faintly in my hand, its carvings pulsing with a soft blue light. As I turned to leave, I noticed something new etched into the walls of the chamber, symbols identical to those on the key, forming a map of sorts. Climbing out of the veil felt surreal, as though I were emerging from a dream into waking life. The journey back to the surface was shorter than expected, though the oppressive atmosphere lingered until I stepped into daylight, blinking against the brightness. I took a moment to orient myself. The forest seemed different now, quieter, almost peaceful. The oppressive weight that had hung over it during my previous visits was gone, replaced by a sense of calm resignation. Even the wind carried a gentler tone, rustling leaves without malice. Driving back to Black Hollow, I couldn't help but reflect on everything I'd learned. The Manitou wasn't a villain. It was a victim, corrupted by centuries of neglect and abuse. and while destroying the artifact, had weakened its influence. The underlying issues remained unresolved. If I truly intended to honor Clara's sacrifice and break the cycle, I needed to do more than simply walk away. Arriving in Black Hollow, I headed straight for Mrs. Whitaker's library. She greeted me with a knowing look, as though she'd anticipated my return. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, softly, gesturing for me to sit. "The truth of the Manitou," I nodded, pulling the obsidian key from my pocket and placing it on the table between us. "Tell me what needs to be done," I said. "How can we restore balance?" Mrs. Whitaker sighed deeply, her frail hands trembling as she reached for the ancient tome. Opening it to a marked page, she revealed instructions for a ritual meant to appease the Manitou, not through sacrifices, but through acts of healing and reconciliation. The old ways were never about fear, she explained. They were about connection. To heal the land, we must first heal ourselves. Only then can the Manitou return to its original purpose. Listening intently, I committed every detail to memory, knowing the road ahead would be long and arduous. But for the first time since discovering my father's disappearance, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that change was possible, however difficult it might be. The weight of the Manitou's truth and the responsibility it had thrust upon me pressed heavily on my shoulders as I prepared to enact the ritual described in the ancient tome. Mrs. Whitaker had warned me that reviving the old ways wouldn't be easy, not after decades of neglect and dismissal by those who saw them as relics of a bygone era. But the alternative, a return to chaos and suffering, was unthinkable. If I wanted to honor Clara's sacrifice and give meaning to everything I'd endured, I had no choice but to see this through. The ritual required careful preparation, both spiritually and materially. According to the tome, it needed to take place during a blood moon, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. This presented its own set of challenges. Blood moons were rare, and the next one wasn't due for months. In the meantime, I dedicated myself to gathering the necessary components: sacred herbs, offerings carved from bone and stone, and ceremonial garments adorned with symbols representing balance and unity. Each item carried significance, woven into the fabric of the land's history and the lives of those who had come before me. But beyond the physical preparations lay an even greater challenge: convincing the people of Black Hollow to participate. For generations, they had distanced themselves from the forest and its legends, dismissing them as superstitions or outright lies. To ask them now to embrace these traditions felt like asking them to rewrite their entire understanding of the world. Yet without their cooperation, the ritual would fail. My first step was approaching Sheriff Hargrove. As a figure of authority and someone deeply connected to the town's history, his support, or lack thereof, would determine how others responded. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me with a mix of curiosity and wariness, having heard rumors about my recent excursions into the forest. "I need your help," I began, laying out the plan as clearly as I could. "The Manitou isn't evil. It's been corrupted by centuries of fear and neglect. We have a chance to heal the land and break the cycle, but we can't do it alone." Hargrove listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. "You're asking a lot," he said finally. "Most folks around here don't want anything to do with that forest. They've spent their whole lives trying to forget what happened there." "I know," I replied, my voice steady despite the lump forming in my throat. But ignoring it hasn't worked. Look at how many people have disappeared over the years. Not just Clara, but countless others. Isn't it we face the truth instead of running from it? For a long moment, Hargrove said nothing. Then with Aisha, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to some of the elders, see if they're willing to listen. But don't expect miracles. Some wounds run too deep to heal overnight." With his tentative agreement secured, I turned my attention to Mrs. Whitaker, whose knowledge of the old ways proved invaluable. She became my guide and mentor, teaching me the chants, dances, and prayers passed down through her family for generations. Her frail frame belied a fierce determination, and she approached the task with a sense of urgency that matched my own. "We're running out of time," she often reminded me, her voice tinged with both hope and desperation. "If we don't act soon, the Manitou will consume us all." As word spread about the planned ritual, reactions varied widely. Some residents welcomed the idea, eager to reclaim a part of their heritage they'd long suppressed. Others dismissed it outright, accusing me of stirring up trouble where none existed. A few even threatened violence, believing I was meddling with forces better left alone. One particularly heated confrontation occurred at Earl's Gas Station, where a group of locals gathered to voice their concerns. "This is madness," shouted a burly man named Hank, his face flushed with anger. "You think dancing around a fire and chanting nonsense is going to fix anything? If people are going to get hurt." "It already has hurt people," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. Clara Bennett gave her life to protect this town, and so many others have paid the price since. Are you really okay with letting that continue? Before Hank could respond, Earl stepped forward, placing a calming hand on his shoulder. "She's right," he said quietly, though his voice carried authority. "We've ignored the forest for too long, pretending it doesn't exist. Maybe it's time we stopped running and faced whatever's out there." Earl's intervention quelled the tension, but it also highlighted the divide within the community. While some were willing to try, others remained staunchly opposed, creating an uneasy atmosphere as the day sticked closer to the blood moon. Amidst the turmoil, I discovered something unexpected. Fragments of stories shared by the townsfolk revealed connections to the Manitou that extended far beyond Black Hollow. One elderly woman spoke of her great-grandfather, who had once served as a mediator between settlers and the tribes, advocating for peace until his mysterious disappearance. Another recounted tales of ancestors who claimed lineage from both worlds, the human and the spirit realm. These revelations underscored the depth of the bond between the land and its people, reinforcing the importance of healing rather than severing ties. With Hargrove's assistance, I identified a location near Devil's Ridge, suitable for the ritual. It was a clearing surrounded by towering trees, their branches intertwining to form a natural canopy overhead. At its center stood a small stone altar, worn smooth by time and weather. Though modest, it radiated a quiet power, as though imbued with the memories of countless ceremonies performed there long ago. Mrs. Whitaker oversaw the preparations, directing volunteers in arranging offerings and marking the perimeter with bundles of sage and sweetgrass. Each detail mattered, from the placement of candles to the alignment of symbols etched into the ground. "You must lead the chant," she instructed me one evening as we worked together under the fading light. "Your voice carries the weight of what you've seen and done. The Manitou will recognize it." I nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. What if I failed? What if the ritual only made things worse? Finally, the night of the blood moon arrived. The sky darkened early, heavy clouds obscuring the stars until the moon rose, casting an eerie crimson glow over the landscape. Dozens of townsfolk gathered in the clearing, their faces illuminated by flickering torchlight. Some looked apprehensive, while others wore expressions of quiet determination. At the center of the circle stood Mrs. Whitaker, her frail frame draped in ceremonial robes adorned with intricate beadwork. Beside her, I held the obsidian key tightly, its surface warm against my palm. Hargrove stood nearby, his presence lending strength to those uncertain about participating. As the moon reached its zenith, Mrs. Whitaker raised her hands, signaling the start of the ritual. The air grew still, charged with anticipation. Slowly, she began the chant, her voice low and rhythmic. One bione, the others joined in, their voices blending into a harmonious melody that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward, holding the key aloft. The words came unbidden, flowing from somewhere deep within me, as though guided by forces beyond my control. Manitou of the hollowed woods, guardian of thresholds and forgotten goods, we seek not dominion, nor claim, nor crown, but harmony restored and balance found. As I spoke, the ground trembled faintly, and a gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the torches. Darkness enveloped us, broken only by the blood-red light of the moon. From the shadows emerged the Manitou, its form shifting endlessly as it approached the altar, its glowing eyes fixed on me, studying me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "You have chosen wisely," it intoned, its voice resonating like a chorus. "But wisdom alone cannot mend what is broken. Will you stand as witness, or will you walk away?" Without hesitation, I knelt before the altar, placing the obsidian key atop it. "I will stand," I vowed, my voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The Manitou nodded slowly, its form shimmering as though satisfied. With a final deafening roar, it dissolved into mist, leaving behind an oppressive silence. When the ritual ended, the crowd dispersed quietly, each person processing what they had witnessed in their own way. Some embraced tearfully, while others retreated into solitude, grappling with emotions too complex to articulate. For me, the experience marked a turning point, not just in my journey, but in the relationship between the people of Black Hollow and the land they called home. Those scars remained. There was a newfound sense of connection, a fragile yet hopeful beginning to a path toward healing. But as I walked away from the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Manitou's question lingered unanswered. Would I truly stand as witness? Or would I falter when tested again? Only time would tell. The weight of the Manitou's truth and the responsibility it had thrust upon me pressed heavily on my shoulders as I prepared to enact the ritual described in the ancient tome. Mrs. Whitaker had warned me that reviving the old ways wouldn't be easy, not after decades of neglect and dismissal by those who saw them as relics of a bygone era. But the alternative, a return to chaos and suffering, was unthinkable. If I wanted to honor Clara's sacrifice and give meaning to everything I'd endured, I had no choice but to see this through. The ritual required careful preparation, both spiritually and materially. According to the tome, it needed to take place during a blood moon, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. This presented its own set of challenges. Blood moons were rare, and the next one wasn't due for months. In the meantime, I dedicated myself to gathering the necessary components: sacred herbs, offerings carved from bone and stone, and ceremonial garments adorned with symbols representing balance and unity. Each item carried significance, woven into the fabric of the land's history and the lives of those who had come before me. But beyond the physical preparations lay an even greater challenge: convincing the people of Black Hollow to participate. For generations, they had distanced themselves from the forest and its legends, dismissing them as superstitions or outright lies. To ask them now to embrace these traditions felt like asking them to rewrite their entire understanding of the world. Yet without their cooperation, the ritual would fail. My first step was approaching Sheriff Hargrove. As a figure of authority and someone deeply connected to the town's history, his support, or lack thereof, would determine how others responded. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me with a mix of curiosity and wariness, having heard rumors about my recent excursions into the forest. "I need your help," I began, laying out the plan as clearly as I could. The Manitou isn't evil. It's been corrupted by centuries of fear and neglect. We have a chance to heal the land and break the cycle, but we can't do it alone. Hargrove listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. "You're asking a lot," he said finally. "Most folks around here don't want anything to do with that forest. They've spent their whole lives trying to forget what happened there." No," I replied, my voice steady despite the lump forming in my throat. "But ignoring it hasn't worked. Look at how many people have disappeared over the years. Not just Clara, but countless others. Isn't it time we faced the truth instead of running from it?" For a long moment, Hargrove said nothing. Then with a sigh, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to some of the elders, see if they're willing to listen. But don't expect miracles. Some wounds run too deep to heal overnight." With his tentative agreement secured, I turned my attention to Mrs. Whitaker, whose knowledge of the old ways proved invaluable. She became my guide and mentor, teaching me the chants, dances, and prayers passed down through her family for generations. Her frail frame belied a fierce determination, and she approached the task with a sense of urgency that matched my own. "We're running out of time," she often reminded me, her voice tinged with both hope and desperation. "If we don't act soon, the Manitou will consume us all." As word spread about the planned ritual, reactions varied widely. Some residents welcomed the idea, eager to reclaim a part of their heritage they'd long suppressed. Others dismissed it outright, accusing me of stirring up trouble where none existed. A few even threatened violence, believing I was meddling with forces better left alone. One particularly heated confrontation occurred at Earl's Gas Station, where a group of locals gathered to voice their concerns. "This is madness," shouted a burly man named Hank, his face flushed with anger. "You think dancing around a fire and chanting nonsense is going to fix anything? People are going to get hurt. It already has hurt people," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. Clara Bennett gave her life to protect this town, and so many others have paid the price since. Are you really okay with letting that continue? Before Hank could respond, Earl stepped forward, placing a calming hand on his shoulder. "She's right," he said quietly, though his voice carried authority. "We've ignored the forest for too long, pretending it doesn't exist. Maybe it's time we stopped running and faced whatever's out there. Earl's intervention quelled the tension, but it also highlighted the divide within the community. While some were willing to try, others remained staunchly opposed, creating an uneasy atmosphere as the day sticked closer to the blood moon. Amidst the turmoil, I discovered something unexpected. Fragments of stories shared by the townsfolk revealed connections to the Manitou that extended far beyond Black Hollow. One elderly woman spoke of her great-grandfather, who had once served as a mediator between settlers and the tribes, advocating for peace until his mysterious disappearance. Another recounted tales of ancestors who claimed lineage from both worlds, the human and the spirit realm. These revelations underscored the depth of the bond between the land and its people, reinforcing the importance of healing rather than severing ties. With Hargrove's assistance, I identified a location near Devil's Ridge, suitable for the ritual. It was a clearing surrounded by towering trees, their branches intertwining to form a natural canopy overhead. At its center stood a small stone altar, worn smooth by time and weather. Though modest, it radiated a quiet power, as though imbued with the memories of countless ceremonies performed there long ago. Mrs. Whitaker oversaw the preparations, directing volunteers in arranging offerings and marking the perimeter with bundles of sage and sweetgrass. Each detail mattered, from the placement of candles to the alignment of symbols etched into the ground. "You must lead the chant," she instructed me one evening as we worked together under the fading light. "Your voice carries the weight of what you've seen and done. The Manitou will recognize it." I nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. What if I failed? What if the ritual only made things worse? Finally, the night of the blood moon arrived. The sky darkened early, heavy clouds obscuring the stars until the moon rose, casting an eerie crimson glow over the landscape. Dozens of townsfolk gathered in the clearing, their faces illuminated by flickering torchlight. Some looked apprehensive, while others wore expressions of quiet determination. At the center of the circle stood Mrs. Whitaker, her frail frame draped in ceremonial robes adorned with intricate beadwork. Beside her, I held the obsidian key tightly, its surface warm against my palm. Hargrove stood nearby, his presence lending strength to those uncertain about participating. As the moon reached its zenith, Mrs. Whitaker raised her hands, signaling the start of the ritual. The air grew still, charged with anticipation. Slowly she began the chant, her voice low and rhythmic. One by one, the others joined in, their voices blending into a harmonious melody that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward, holding the key aloft. The words came unbidden, flowing from somewhere deep within me, as though guided by forces beyond my control. Manitou of the hollowed woods, guardian of thresholds and forgotten goods, we seek not dominion, nor claim, nor crown, but harmony restored and balance found. As I spoke, the ground trembled faintly, and a gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the torches. Darkness enveloped us, broken only by the blood-red light of the moon. From the shadows emerged the Manitou, its form shifting endlessly as it approached the altar, its glowing eyes fixed on me, studying me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "You have chosen wisely," it intoned, its voice resonating like a chorus. "But wisdom alone cannot mend what is broken. Will you stand as witness?" or will you walk away? Without hesitation, I knelt before the altar, placing the obsidian key atop it. I will stand, I vowed, my voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The Manitou nodded slowly, its form shimmering as though satisfied. With a final, deafening roar, it dissolved into mist, leaving behind an oppressive silence. When the ritual ended, the crowd dispersed quietly, each person processing what they had witnessed in their own way. Some embraced tearfully, while others retreated into solitude, grappling with emotions too complex to articulate. For me, the experience marked a turning point, not just in my journey, but in the relationship between the people of Black Hollow and the land they called home. Though scars remained, there was a newfound sense of connection, a fragile yet hopeful beginning to a path toward healing. But as I walked away from the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Manitou's question lingered unanswered. Would I truly stand as witness, or would I falter when tested again? Only time would tell. The aftermath of the ritual was a tapestry of conflicting emotions, both for me and the people of Black Hollow. Though the Manitou had seemingly accepted our offering and retreated into silence, the weight of what we'd done, or attempted to do, hung heavily in the air. It wasn't just about the immediate outcome. It was about confronting centuries of fear, mistrust, and denial. For many, including myself, the ritual marked the beginning of a reckoning, not just with the land and its guardian spirit, but with the choices that had shaped their lives up until that point. As dawn broke over Devil's Ridge, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, I found myself sitting alone on the edge of the clearing, staring at the obsidian key, still resting atop the stone altar. Its surface no longer pulsed with light, nor did it hum faintly beneath my touch. Instead, it felt inert, lifeless almost, as though whatever power it once held had been expended during the ritual. Yet despite its apparent dormancy, I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. Something deep within me insisted that it belonged with me, a reminder not only of what I'd endured, but also of the responsibilities I now carried. Over the following days, life in Black Hollow began to settle into a tentative rhythm. The townsfolk went about their routines, though there was an unspoken acknowledgement that things were different now. Conversations once dominated by gossip or mundane concerns now turned toward reflections on the forest, the Manitou, and the delicate balance between humanity and nature. Some spoke openly about their experiences during the ritual, sharing stories passed down through generations that had long been dismissed as mere folklore. Others remained silent, their expressions betraying a mix of awe and unease. Sheriff Hargrove emerged as an unexpected advocate for continued efforts to heal the relationship between the town and the land. He organized community meetings where residents could voice their thoughts and fears without judgment. These gatherings often devolved into heated debates, particularly when discussing how best to honor the old ways while adapting them to modern times. But even amidst disagreements, there was a sense of progress, a willingness to listen and learn from one another. Mrs. Whitaker played a crucial role in these discussions, acting as both mediator and historian. Her knowledge of indigenous traditions provided a foundation upon which new practices could be built, blending ancient wisdom with contemporary sensibilities. Under her guidance, volunteers began storing scattered throughout the forest, clearing away debris and planting native flora to encourage regeneration. Each act of restoration served as a symbolic gesture of reconciliation, acknowledging past wrongs while working toward the brighter future. Yet for all the strides being made, Resistance persisted. A vocal minority refused to participate, viewing the renewed interest in the old ways as misguided or even dangerous. Their skepticism wasn't entirely unfounded. After all, the Manitou had been feared for good reason, and memories of those who had vanished into the woods lingered painfully fresh in everyone's minds. Convincing this group to embrace change proved challenging, requiring patience and persistence far beyond what anyone had anticipated. One evening, as I walked along the outskirts of town, I encountered Earl outside his gas station, smoking a cigarette under the dim glow of a flickering neon sign. His expression was somber, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something darker and more introspective. "How are you holding up?" I asked, leaning against the wall beside him. Earl exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the night air before responding. "Honestly, I don't know. Part of me feels lighter, like maybe we finally started making amends. But another part..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Another part," I prompted gently. "Another part wonders if we've only delayed the inevitable," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That thing out there, it's not gone. It's waiting, watching, and sooner or later, it'll demand something from us again." His words sent a chill down my spine, resonating with doubts I'd tried desperately to suppress. The Manitou hadn't explicitly stated whether the ritual had succeeded in mending the rift between worlds, while its acceptance of our offering suggested some measure of forgiveness. The underlying corruption remained, an insidious force rooted in centuries of neglect and abuse. Could any amount of effort truly undo that damage, or were we merely postponing the next cycle of suffering? I didn't have an answer, and neither did Earl. We stood there in silence for several minutes, each lost in our own thoughts, until he finally stubbed out his cigarette and turned to face me. "Whatever happens next," he said firmly, "we can't let fear dictate our actions. Not anymore." With that, he disappeared inside the gas station, leaving me alone with the oppressive stillness of the night. Back at Mrs. Whitaker's library, I spent hours poring over the ancient tome, searching for clues about what came next. The ritual described within its pages had been designed to appease the Manitou temporarily, buying time for deeper healing to take root. But beyond that, the text offered little guidance, ending abruptly with vague references to cycles and thresholds. Frustrated, I flipped through the remaining pages, hoping to find additional insights overlooked during previous readings. That's when I noticed something unusual. A series of symbols etched into the margins, too faint to see clearly without holding the page up to the light. Tracing them with my finger, I realized they matched the carvings on the obsidian key. Intrigued, I pulled out the key and held it alongside the book, aligning the symbols carefully. As I did so, a hidden compartment in the tome's spine clicked open, revealing a folded piece of parchment tucked inside. Unfolding it cautiously, I discovered a map unlike anything I'd seen before. Unlike conventional maps marked with roads and landmarks, this one depicted constellations overlaid onto a topographical representation of the Appalachian region. At its center was a location labeled simply as the Nexus. My pulse quickened as I studied the map more closely. According to accompanying notes scrawled in the margins, the Nexus represented a convergence point where multiple thresholds intersected, places where the veil between worlds was thinnest. Accessing it required navigating specific alignments dictated by celestial events, such as eclipses or planetary conjunctions. Could this be the solution we needed? If the Nexus truly existed, perhaps reaching it would allow us to address the source of the corruption directly rather than treating symptoms. But getting there wouldn't be easy, not physically, mentally, or emotionally. Determined to explore the Nexus further, I shared my findings with Mrs. Whitaker, who listened intently before nodding gravely. The Nexus has been spoken of in whispers among elders, she explained. It is said to be a place of immense power, capable of reshaping reality itself. But accessing it comes at great cost. Many who attempt the journey never return. Despite her warning, I knew this was a risk worth taking. With her blessing and reluctant support from Sheriff Hargrove, I began assembling a small team willing to accompany me. Among them were Earl, whose practical skills and intimate knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable, and a young woman named Lily, whose family claimed lineage from the original tribes that revered the Manitou. Together we formed a diverse yet cohesive unit, united by a shared desire to see the mission through. Preparations took weeks, during which we meticulously planned every detail of the expedition. Supplies were gathered, routes mapped, and contingency plans devised for potential obstacles. Mrs. Whitaker provided guidance based on her extensive research, emphasizing the importance of maintaining balance and respect throughout the journey. Must approach the Nexus not as conquerors seeking dominion, but as humble stewards entrusted with safeguarding the harmony between worlds. She reminded us repeatedly, failure to do so may result in consequences far worse than anything we've faced thus far. Her words weighed heavily on my mind as we set out under the cover of darkness, guided by the stars and the faint glow of the moon. The journey to the Nexus tested us in ways none of us could have anticipated. Terrain grew increasingly treacherous, forcing us to navigate narrow ridges and dense thickets teeming with wildlife. Temperatures plummeted unexpectedly, and storms rolled in without warning, drenching us in freezing rain. Sleep became elusive, haunted by vivid dreams of shadowy figures and glowing blue eyes. Yet despite the physical hardships, it was the psychological toll that proved most challenging. Doubts crept in, gnawing at our resolve and testing the bonds we'd forged. Arguments erupted over minor disputes, threatening to fracture the fragile unity we'd worked so hard to establish. Several times, I considered turning back, questioning whether pursuing the Nexus was worth the sacrifices demanded of us. But then, moments of clarity emerged, brief glimpses of beauty amidst chaos that reignited our determination. A sunrise breaking over jagged peaks bathed in golden light, a rare bird call echoing through the valley, reminding us of life's resilience, shared laughter around a campfire, born from camaraderie forged through adversity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the Nexus, a cavernous chasm surrounded by towering cliffs etched with glowing runes. At its center floated a massive crystal suspended midair, radiating energy so potent it vibrated through the ground beneath our feet. Approaching cautiously, I held the obsidian key aloft, its carvings aligning perfectly with patterns etched into the crystal. As I touched it to the surface, a blinding flash engulfed us, pulling us into a realm beyond comprehension. In that moment, everything changed. Time and space dissolved into a kaleidoscope of images and sensations, each fragment representing a choice made and consequence born. I saw civilizations rise and fall, ecosystems flourish and collapse, lives intertwined in intricate webs of cause and effect. Among them were glimpses of Clara and my father, not as they were, but as they could have been. In one vision they stood side by side, hands clasped tightly, smiling with a serenity I'd never known possible. When the vision subsided, I found myself back in the clearing near Devil's Ridge, the obsidian key clutched tightly in my hand. Gone was the oppressive weight that had hung over the forest for so long, replaced by a profound sense of peace. Though scars remained, both visible and invisible, hope bloomed anew. The Manitou's presence lingered quietly, no longer vengeful but watchful, a guardian restored to its original purpose. As I walked away, I knew the journey wasn't truly over. Healing takes time, effort, and sacrifice, but for the first time in years, I believed redemption was possible, not just for myself, but for everyone touched by the legacy of shadows. And with that belief came a promise to carry the burden of knowledge, to honor those who came before, and to forge a path forward guided by compassion, understanding, and unwavering resolve.